A quiet neighborhood. A respected black judge driving home after a long day until flashing lights turn everything upside down. What seems like a routine traffic stop quickly spirals into something far more sinister when a prejudiced cop decides tonight's the night to make a statement. But what she doesn't know is this isn't just any man. This is Judge Malcolm Hayes, and he's about to challenge every assumption, every bias, and expose a system that's long overdue for a reckoning. What follows is a confrontation. You won't believe, a fight for dignity, justice, and truth that unfolds right in the heart of his own community. Stay with us, because this story builds to a moment that no one saw coming. And before we dive in, let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. There are moments in life when everything feels just right, when the weight of the world seems to lift, and all that remains is peace. For Judge Malcolm Hayes, this was one of those rare evenings. After a long day presiding over a heated civil rights case in the heart of Georgia, he was finally heading home, back to the quiet comfort of his neighborhood, a place where he could exhale, where the troubles of the courtroom melted away. If only for a while. Malcolm wasn't just any man. At 63, he was a symbol of resilience, of justice, a federal appellate judge who had spent decades fighting for fairness in a system that didn't always offer it. Born and raised on the south side of Atlanta, Malcolm had grown up in a world where opportunity wasn't given, it was earned. Fought for his mother, a schoolteacher, and his father, a mechanic, had worked tirelessly to ensure he stayed on the right path. They taught him to believe in hard work, in education, in dignity, and Malcolm had taken those lessons to heart. Now, with silver streaking through his once black hair and lines of wisdom etched into his face, Malcolm carried the weight of his experiences proudly. Every decision he made from the bench was guided by the stories of people like him, people who had faced injustice, who had struggled, who had persevered. His rulings had freed the wrongly accused, exposed corruption, and made powerful enemies along the way. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Malcolm just wanted to enjoy the drive home. The streets of Brookdale Heights glowed softly beneath the amber hues of the setting sun. It was a well-kept neighborhood, lined with old oak trees and brick houses with manicured lawns, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and kids rode their bikes without fear. It wasn't just home, it was a testament to everything Malcolm had worked for, a quiet corner of the world where he could breathe. As his black Lexus ES 350 glided down those familiar streets, Malcolm let the smooth rhythm of Miles Davis fill the cabin, the soft trumpet notes dancing with the evening breeze. His hands rested easily on the leather steering wheel, the tension of the courtroom slowly easing from his shoulders. The case he'd ruled on today still lingered in the back of his mind. Another young black man facing trumped-up charges, but Malcolm knew he had done the right thing, as he always tried to. The law was his weapon, and justice was his goal. Tonight, though, there were no arguments to hear, no judgments to deliver, just the simple pleasure of driving beneath the golden glow of streetlights, the low hum of the engine, and the promise of a quiet evening ahead. He could already picture himself in his favorite armchair, a glass of sweet tea in hand, watching the news with a critical eye. Maybe he'd even call his daughter, check in on her, and the grandkids. But as Malcolm rounded the bend near Sycamore Lane, something flickered in his rearview mirror. At first, it barely registered, just the faint flash of headlights behind him. He paid it no mind. But then came the unmistakable burst of red and blue lights, slicing through the calm, pulsing against the back of his car like an alarm bell. Malcolm's brow furrowed. His foot eased off the gas. He wasn't speeding. His registration was current. Everything was in order. Still, the lights grew brighter, closer. A siren pierced the soft jazz in his car. its shrill cry shattering the peace of the evening. With a measured breath, Malcolm signaled and pulled to the side of the road, the Lexus easing to a stop beneath a towering oak tree. The neighborhood, so familiar and safe just moments ago, now felt heavy with uncertainty. He turned off the music, rolled down his window, and placed his hands firmly on the steering wheel. His pulse quickened, not from guilt, because he had done nothing wrong, but from the knowledge of how these things could go. How often he'd read headlines that began with a routine traffic stop and ended with a tragedy. And even though he was a judge, even though he'd spent his life upholding the law, he knew that tonight, in this moment, none of that might matter. The crunch of footsteps on the pavement echoed in the stillness. Malcolm glanced in his side mirror, catching sight of a figure approaching. The officer's posture was rigid, purposeful. The beam of a flashlight swept across the back of his car, then the side panel. Before stopping at his window, Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he kept his face calm, his gaze steady. He had faced down attorneys, lobbyists, and corrupt officials. He could handle this, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful evening had just come to a screeching halt, and somewhere in the back of his mind, an uneasy thought crept in. This wasn't going to be just another routine stop. The crunch of boots on asphalt grew louder as the officer closed the distance. Malcolm Hayes kept his hands steady on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed forward, his breathing calm but purposeful. He'd been in enough courtrooms to know how quickly things could spiral. His heart rate ticked up, not from guilt, but from the bitter understanding that sometimes who you are doesn't matter when someone's already decided what they see. The officer stepped into view, a woman, tall and broad-shouldered, her features hard beneath the brim of her patrol hat. Her badge glinted under the faint glow of the streetlights, and the sharp beam of her flashlight cut across Malcolm's face. She squinted at him, as if what she saw didn't quite fit what she expected. "License and registration," she barked, her voice cold, without even a hint of courtesy. Not even a simple "good evening." Malcolm kept his voice smooth, steady. "Yes, officer. May I ask what this is about?" The officer, Carla Jensen, didn't blink. She just leveled the flashlight at his eyes. "License and registration," she repeated, her tone sharper now, leaving no room for conversation. Malcolm nodded slowly, deliberate in every move. He released his right hand from the wheel, pointed to the glove compartment, and eased it open. Inside were the neatly folded papers. He always kept proof of insurance, registration, everything in order. He pulled them out, along with his license, and handed them over. "Malcolm Hayes," he said calmly, looking her straight in the eye, "federal appellate judge. I live just a few blocks over, on Willow Grove Drive." Jensen glanced at the documents, barely registering the name or the title. Her eyes didn't waver, her face unmoved. "Step out of the vehicle." The words landed like a slap. Malcolm blinked. "Excuse me, you heard me." "Step out of the vehicle," Jensen repeated, this time her hand drifting close to the holster at her hip. There was no mistaking the shift in the air. The calm of the evening, the peaceful jazz that had once filled his car, the golden hue of the neighborhood streetlights, all of it, seemed to fade under the weight of her suspicion. Malcolm's mind raced. He had been through enough in life to know the dangerous game that could begin when authority stopped listening. He took a steady breath, willing his body to remain composed. "Officer Jensen," he said, his voice low but firm, "I would appreciate an explanation before I comply. What have I done wrong?" Jensen didn't budge. "This car matches the description of a vehicle reported stolen last week." "Step out of the car." Malcolm stared at her, disbelief mixing with something deeper, a quiet, simmering anger. He knew what this was. He'd seen it too many times in court, read it too many times in the news. But it was different now. It was him on the receiving end. Slowly, deliberately, Malcolm reached for the door handle. "I am complying," he said, his tone controlled but tight. "But this is my vehicle. I purchased it myself. All the documents are in order." The door creaked open, and Malcolm stepped out, standing tall beside the Lexus. The officer's flashlight followed him, bouncing off the polished surface of the car. The neighborhood, so familiar and comforting just moments ago, now felt hostile, silent, watching. Jensen squared her shoulders, looking him up and down. "Face the vehicle," she ordered. Malcolm hesitated, then slowly turned toward the car, his hands resting lightly on the roof. Every movement, every breath was deliberate, controlled, because he knew better than to make a single wrong move. "Officer Jensen," Malcolm tried again, turning his head just slightly. "This is a mistake. If you run the plates, you'll see that the vehicle is registered to me." But Jensen wasn't interested in listening. She circled the car, her flashlight scanning every inch, searching for anything that could justify her suspicion. Her jaw was clenched, her posture rigid. Within minutes, another set of headlights pierced the dark. A second patrol car pulled up behind Jensen's cruiser, engine rumbling low. Out stepped a younger officer, Mike Rowan. He was lean, early 30s, with an uncertain expression that flickered across his face the moment he took in the scene before him. His eyes shifted from Malcolm to Jensen, then back again. Rowan approached slowly, keeping his hands at his sides. "Evening," he said quietly to Jensen. "Everything all right here?" Jensen gave a sharp nod. "Vehicle matches the description of a stolen car," she snapped. "We're following protocol." Rowan glanced at Malcolm, the faintest crease forming between his brows. He seemed to hesitate, but said nothing. "Not yet." Malcolm spoke up again, keeping his voice calm, controlled. "Officer Rowan," he said, meeting the younger man's gaze. "My name is Judge Malcolm Hayes. I live just around the corner. If you check the registration, you'll see this car is mine." "This is a misunderstanding," Rowan looked at Jensen, then back at Malcolm, his lips pressing into a thin line. "We'll verify that," he muttered, but Jensen was already waving him off. "Search the vehicle," she ordered. "Start with the trunk." Rowan froze, visibly uncomfortable. He looked from Malcolm's composed stance to the commanding glare of Jensen. The tension thickened, a rope pulling taut between the three of them. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His hands still rested on the roof of the Lexus, his posture unyielding. "I'm cooperating," he said evenly. "But you have no right to search my vehicle without probable cause." Jensen ignored him, her glare sharp. "Probable cause is that this vehicle matches a stolen car report." Malcolm's eyes darkened, but he remained still. His entire career, his reputation stood against the weight of these baseless accusations. He was a federal judge, and yet, in this moment, none of that mattered, not to Jensen. Rowan circled the car, hesitating at the trunk. His fingers hovered over the latch, his gaze flickering back to Malcolm. For a moment, it seemed like the younger officer might object, but instead, with a quiet sigh, he popped the trunk. Malcolm could only stand there, helpless, as the invasion of his privacy began. The hum of the streetlights, the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze, all of it faded beneath the rising pulse of injustice, and Malcolm knew, deep in his bones, that this night was far from over. There's something about silence that can feel louder than any sound. As Malcolm Hayes stood beside his car, the weight of that silence pressed down on him, his hands resting lightly on the cool surface of his Lexus, betrayed none of the storm that churned beneath the surface, but inside, he could feel the tension rising, his heartbeat quickening, his pulse drumming steady beneath the surface of his calm exterior. He'd faced challenges before. His life had been one long series of uphill battles from the dusty streets of Atlanta, where he was raised, to the towering halls of justice, where he now presided. He'd learned early on that dignity, once taken, was hard to reclaim. And right now, he felt that dignity slipping through his fingers. Officer Carla Jensen stood nearby, her posture stiff, her hand resting far too close to her holster. She wasn't looking for answers. She wasn't trying to understand. She was only seeing what she wanted to see: a black man driving a luxury car in a wealthy neighborhood. No judge's robe, No courtroom authority, no title could protect him from what she had already decided about him. The younger officer, Mike Rowan, lingered near the rear of the car, his unease evident in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't as hardened as Jensen. No. His eyes flickered with hesitation. A flicker of doubt Malcolm caught immediately. But still, he followed orders. Still, he moved toward the trunk, hands hovering over the latch, like they didn't want to make contact. Jensen didn't miss a beat. "Open it," she barked, her voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. Rowan gave one last uncertain glance toward Malcolm, then reached out and popped the trunk. The soft creak of metal lifting sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet street. Malcolm's chest tightened, his throat dried. He knew what was in his trunk, nothing but the standard fare, an emergency roadside kit, a small bag with jumper cables, maybe a spare umbrella. That was all. There was nothing to fear, and yet the fear came anyway, because when someone like Jensen already has a narrative in their head, it doesn't take much to make it real. Rowan leaned into the trunk, his flashlight sweeping across the contents. At first, there was nothing unusual, but then he paused. His light stopped on something that Malcolm knew wasn't his, a small black duffel bag tucked neatly in the corner. Rowan hesitated. His eyes darted to Jensen. "There's something here," he said, his voice uncertain. Jensen strode over, the corner of her mouth lifting into a faint smirk. "What is it?" she demanded. Rowan pulled out the bag, holding it up for her to see. It looked heavy, weighted. Malcolm stared at it, his stomach sinking. That bag wasn't his. He'd never seen it before in his life. Jensen unzipped the bag slowly, her movements deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Inside, neat bundles of cash, a few small plastic packets that could easily be mistaken for drugs. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. He took a step forward instinctively, his voice low but urgent. "That's not mine," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I've never seen that bag before." Jensen didn't even look at him. She just smirked, holding the bag up for Rowan to see. "Well, isn't that convenient?" she said, sarcasm dripping from every word. Malcolm felt a surge of heat rise to his face. "You planted that," he accused, his voice still calm but laced with steel. "You're framing me." Rowan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering between Jensen and Malcolm. The doubt in him was growing, spreading across his face like a crack in glass. But Jensen wasn't budging. She crossed her arms, leaning slightly toward Malcolm. "Framing you?" she echoed, mocking. "You think we have time for that? Or maybe you think being a judge gives you a free pass." Malcolm stood tall, his eyes burning into hers. "I think you've already decided who I am," he said, his voice steady, "and it has nothing to do with what's in that trunk." For a moment, Jensen's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Turn around," she ordered, stepping closer. "Hands behind your back." Malcolm's heart pounded. The indignity of it all, the bag, the accusations, the handcuffs, every bit of it felt like an assault on everything he'd worked for. Every hour spent in law school, every case he'd presided over, every fight he'd taken on for the voiceless, it meant nothing here. Not tonight. Not in the eyes of Officer Carla Jensen. "Officer Rowan," Malcolm said, turning his attention to the younger man, "you know, this isn't right. Check the registration. Verify who I am." Rowan hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak, but then Jensen shot him a look. A warning. "Do it," Jensen snapped, her voice cold and sharp. Rowan swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He took a step back, pulling out his radio, but his hands shook slightly. Malcolm caught that shake. He knew the kid wasn't sure, and that gave him the smallest sliver of hope. But Jensen wasn't done. "I said, turn around," she repeated, her voice rising. Malcolm stood still. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice calm but filled with quiet power. "You know who I am, And you know this will not end well for you. Jensen's hand hovered dangerously close to her taser now, her jaw clenched. But just as she stepped forward, the sound of a screen door creaking open echoed down the street. A voice called out, "What's going on here?" It was Evelyn Robinson, Malcolm's neighbor. Her voice was sharp, protective. More lights flicked on from nearby houses. Curtains shifted. Faces appeared in windows. The neighborhood was watching. Jensen's eyes flickered toward the growing attention. But even as the crowd began to gather, even as cameras lifted into the air recording, Malcolm knew this wasn't over. No, this was only the beginning. There's a certain weight to public humiliation. It doesn't settle quietly. It presses down, heavy and relentless, especially when you know you've done nothing wrong. And for Judge Malcolm Hayes, that weight settled squarely on his shoulders as he stood beside his car, hands resting on the roof, the black duffel bag sitting ominously on the hood for everyone to see, a bag that wasn't his. A bag filled with cash and what could easily be passed off as drugs. The kind of bag that ruined lives. But what made it worse wasn't just the accusation. It was the eyes. It started with one neighbor. A light flicked on in a window across the street. A curtain shifted, and then another. Someone cracked open a front door, squinting out into the night, curious. The flashing red and blue lights had drawn them in, like moths to a flame. They couldn't help themselves, and why should they? This was their neighborhood, their street, and now something was happening right outside their homes. The quiet of Brookdale Heights was gone, replaced with murmurs, whispers, the hum of camera phones clicking on. Malcolm caught it all. The glow of screens held high, the faces pressed to glass. Some curious, some concerned, but the worst were the looks of judgment, those subtle frowns, the narrow eyes. They didn't know the full story yet, but the image told them enough. A black man, standing beside a luxury car, police officers, a mysterious bag. It was a picture that could speak louder than any words. The sting of it ran deeper than Malcolm cared to admit. Officer Carla Jensen stood by the trunk, arms crossed, her smirk returning now that she had an audience. The bag might as well have been a trophy in her eyes. Proof that her instincts, her biases were justified. She wasn't backing down, but it was Officer Mike Rowan who looked the most unsettled. His gaze kept drifting from the bag to Malcolm, and then to the growing crowd. His lips pressed into a thin line. He shifted on his feet. The doubt was clear. He was thinking it. You could see it in the furrow of his brow. But thinking wasn't the same as acting. "Stay right where you are," Jensen barked, her voice loud now, carrying across the street, making sure everyone heard. This investigation isn't over. Malcolm didn't move. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. But his fists clenched at his sides, the frustration swelling inside him like a rising tide. From across the street, an older voice rang out, sharp and defiant. "Carla Jensen, what are you doing?" Everyone turned. It was Evelyn Robinson, the same neighbor who had called out before. She stood at the edge of her porch, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, house slippers on, but her posture straight, solid. A woman who'd lived long enough to know right from wrong and wasn't afraid to say it. "I know that man," she shouted, stepping down from her porch, marching across the lawn. "That's Judge Hayes. You're making a mistake." Jensen stiffened. She turned toward Evelyn, trying to wave her off. "Ma'am, please return to your home. This doesn't concern you." But Evelyn wasn't going anywhere. "You're dead wrong if you think I'm going to sit back and watch this," she shot back, standing squarely at the curb now, hands on her hips. "This man has done more for this community than you ever will, and you're standing here treating him like a criminal." More neighbors followed. Some stepped out onto their porches. A few crossed the street to stand behind Evelyn. Others stayed back but raised their phones higher, catching every moment. The crowd was growing. Malcolm felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone, but Jensen's voice rose, louder now, trying to hold on to control. "Step back, all of you. This is a police matter." Her words only fueled the fire. A younger man in the crowd, Derek, maybe mid-20s, held up his phone, the red recording light glowing bright. "Everyone's watching. Officer, Facebook Live. Twitter. Don't think you can sweep this under the rug." Rowan glanced nervously at Jensen, but she ignored him. Her gaze stayed locked on Malcolm, as if the weight of the crowd didn't exist. Malcolm straightened, his voice calm but powerful. "You're humiliating me in front of my own community," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, without cause, without evidence. Jensen's jaw clenched. "We found the bag. You planted that bag," Malcolm shot back, steel in his voice. "You know it. I know it. And now, everyone else watching knows it." The tension snapped like a whip. The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through the air. Evelyn stepped forward again, eyes blazing. "If you had any decency, you'd check that man's ID. You'd check the plates. But you won't, will you? Because you've already decided who he is." Rowan shifted again, his discomfort growing. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Jensen cut him off with a sharp glance. "Get back in the car and check the plates," Jensen snapped at Rowan. He froze. The command was clear, but so was the doubt flickering across his face. Malcolm turned toward him, locking eyes. "Officer Rowan," he said quietly, firmly, "do the right thing." For a moment, the world stood still. The flashing lights continued their endless cycle. Red, blue, red, blue. The cameras rolled, and the crowd waited, breaths held tight, as one man stood at the center of it all, fighting not just for himself, but for the principle that no one should be judged by the color of their skin. Rowan finally turned, retreating toward his patrol car, radio in hand. Jensen stood frozen, her posture still defiant, but the cracks were starting to show. Her smirk had faded. The crowd's eyes burned holes in her armor. Malcolm remained where he was, tall, unyielding, his dignity intact despite everything they were trying to strip from him. Because even in the face of injustice, even when the system closed in, he knew one thing: the truth has a way of coming to light. The night air felt heavier now. The weight of suspicion, of humiliation, pressed down harder with every passing second. Judge Malcolm Hayes stood motionless beside his car, the black duffel bag still sitting on the hood like a cruel joke, its contents on full display for the growing crowd to see. Bundles of cash, plastic packets that, to the untrained eye, screamed criminal. But Malcolm knew the truth. He had never seen that bag in his life. It wasn't his, and yet there it was, planted, or worse, believed to be planted by someone who had already made up her mind about him. Officer Carla Jensen stood firm across from him, arms crossed, a cold smirk lingering at the corners of her lips. She hadn't spoken in the last few minutes, letting the image speak for itself. The confident black man brought low, his reputation, his dignity, lying beside him in that bag. But the crowd gathered around them wasn't buying it. Not completely. Evelyn Robinson remained at the front of the pack, eyes sharp, her voice unrelenting as she stood for Malcolm, refusing to let the weight of the accusation crush him alone. Others had joined two neighbors, familiar faces, some young, some old. The community that Malcolm had served for decades now stood behind him, a growing wall of witnesses to this unfolding injustice. Officer Mike Rowan stood near his patrol car, hesitating. His fingers hovered over the buttons on his radio, his body tense, as though caught between duty and doubt. He kept glancing at Jensen, then back at Malcolm, the conflict visible in his eyes. He knew something was off. You could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his foot tapped restlessly against the pavement. He was a man at a crossroads, watching as the scales tipped dangerously towards something he couldn't defend. Malcolm's voice broke the uneasy silence, calm but cutting. You've searched my car. You've found what you wanted. But you haven't run my plates. You haven't checked my ID. You've got no idea who I am." Jensen shot him a glare. "I know enough." Malcolm held her gaze, steady and unwavering. "No, you don't," the crowd murmured, shifting, whispering. The tension thickened, wrapping around everyone present like chains. Rowan's voice finally broke through, soft at first, but growing stronger. "We should check. Just run the plates. Verify." Jensen turned on him, her expression fierce. "We found the bag. That's all we need." But even as she said it, the words felt hollow. Her authority was cracking, and she knew it. The crowd, the lights of the camera phones, the unwavering presence of Evelyn Robinson, all of it bore down on her, questioning every move, every decision. Malcolm stepped forward, just enough to let his voice carry, but not enough to provoke. "Run the plates," he repeated, louder this time, looking directly at Rowan. "Do your job the right way." Rowan hesitated. His eyes flickered to Jensen, who shook her head almost imperceptibly, warning him not to cross her. But Rowan's jaw tightened. He turned back toward his car, lifting his radio. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift. Jensen's voice rose sharply, her desperation showing. "This vehicle matches a stolen car report from last week. That gives us probable cause." End of story. Malcolm took a breath, letting it settle deep in his chest before he spoke again. "If it matches, the system will confirm that. And if it doesn't, what then?" Jensen said nothing. She just crossed her arms tighter, as if holding herself together by sheer will. Rowan keyed into the radio, his voice low but clear. "Dispatch, this is Officer Rowan. I need a check on a black Lexus ES 350 license plate, 7HS3PL. Silence. Then static. Then the voice of dispatch, crackling through. "Copy that, Officer Rowan. Running the plate now." The crowd held its collective breath. Malcolm stood tall, his face calm, but inside, a storm raged. He had spent his life navigating the intricacies of the law. He knew how fragile the line between justice and injustice could be, and tonight he stood squarely on that line, teetering between dignity and degradation. Jensen paced now, her boots tapping sharply against the pavement. She knew the moment was slipping from her grasp. She had built this confrontation brick by brick, convinced that her instincts, her prejudice would justify it all. But the foundation beneath her feet was beginning to crack. The crowd shifted again, the whispers louder now. Words like setup, racism, and injustice floated through the air like smoke. Evelyn stepped forward once more, her voice steady. "We're all watching, Officer Jensen. Every last one of us. So I suggest you listen too." Jensen shot her a glare, but Evelyn didn't flinch. The radio crackled again. "Dispatch to Officer Rowan. The vehicle is registered to a Malcolm Hayes, Willow Grove Drive. No reports of theft. Clean." The words hit like a hammer. The crowd erupted in a chorus of disbelief, frustration, and anger. Phones lifted higher, catching every second. Evelyn let out a sharp laugh, her eyes blazing. "I told you," she shouted. "You've been dragging this man through the mud for nothing." Rowan stepped back from the radio, his face pale, his hands slightly trembling. He turned to Jensen, waiting for her to speak. But Jensen stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, her posture rigid. Malcolm didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His voice was calm, steady, but filled with the weight of truth. "I told you from the start who I was. I told you this was my car, but you didn't care. You didn't even bother to check. You went straight for the assumption, straight for the accusation." Jensen's jaw clenched, but the words didn't come. She glanced around at the crowd, at the phones recording her every move, at Rowan's horrified expression, and then Malcolm pointed to the bag, still sitting on the hood. "So now tell me, Officer Jensen, If that bag didn't come from me, where did it come from? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, because deep down, they all knew the answer. Jensen's smirk was gone. Her authority crumbled, replaced by something raw fear. Fear of what came next. Fear of what the world would see when those videos hit the internet. When the headlines started to roll out. But Malcolm wasn't done. I know the law, Officer Jensen, better than you. And I know what happens next. You've humiliated me in front of my neighbors, my community. But you've also exposed yourself. And I promise you this, it won't end here. The crowd cheered, clapping, nodding, standing taller behind Malcolm as he reclaimed the dignity they tried to strip from him. And as the flashing lights continued to pulse, casting their eerie glow across the street, Jensen could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The air felt electric now, thick with tension that refused to settle. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It wasn't even about the bag sitting on the hood of Judge Malcolm Hayes's Lexus, staring back like some damning piece of evidence. No, this was bigger now. This was a battle for dignity, for truth, playing out on the quiet streets of Brookdale Heights under the glare of flashing red and blue lights and the watchful eyes of a growing crowd. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder. Some had crossed arms, lips pursed in disbelief. Others recorded every second, their phones held high like torches in the dark, ready to expose every injustice to the world. And at the center of it all stood Malcolm, still tall, still unwavering. Even as the humiliation tried to claw at his spirit, he wasn't alone. Not anymore. Evelyn Robinson stood close, her silver hair catching the light, her eyes sharp and unrelenting. She'd lived here for decades, and she wasn't about to let this happen on her watch. More neighbors gathered behind her people. Malcolm had greeted at block parties, waved to on morning walks. They were here now, witnesses to something they couldn't unsee. Officer Carla Jensen, though, wasn't ready to back down. Her stance grew tighter, more defensive. She paced in small circles, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. You could almost see the gears turning in her head, how to maintain control, how to salvage this without crumbling under the weight of her own mistake. But the cracks were showing. The longer the crowd stood there, the more the doubt settled in her eyes. And then there was Officer Mike Rowan, standing near his patrol car, his radio still in hand. His face told a different story, a mix of regret, hesitation, and the creeping realization that he might be on the wrong side of something bigger than he'd signed up for. His eyes kept flickering between Jensen and Malcolm, between the crowd and the bag on the hood. He knew the truth, even if he hadn't said it out loud yet. You could feel it. Malcolm broke the silence. His voice, calm but edged with iron, sliced through the thick air. "You heard dispatch," he said. "The car is mine. Registered, clean. So now what?" The question wasn't just for Jensen. It was for the crowd, for the cameras, for anyone listening. Jensen straightened, trying to regain footing. "We still found that bag," she shot back, gesturing toward the duffel like it was the smoking gun. But Malcolm didn't flinch. "A bag that wasn't there before," he countered, his voice steady. "A bag that conveniently appeared when you searched my car without cause." Evelyn stepped closer, arms crossed, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you really gonna stand there and pretend this isn't exactly what it looks like?" More voices rose from the crowd, questions, challenges, outrage. "Run the fingerprints," one man called out. "Check the cameras," shouted another. Rowan's head lowered, shoulders tense. You could see him weighing his options, fighting the instinct to walk away from this mess entirely. Jensen turned toward him, her voice sharp, clipped. "Rowan, secure the scene." But Rowan didn't move. He stood there, locked in place, the weight of his badge feeling heavier than ever before. Malcolm took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on Rowan. "You know the truth," he said quietly. "Don't let her drag you down with her." Rowan swallowed hard, His fingers twitched against the radio. His eyes met Malcolm's, and for a split second, there was a flicker of something more, a glimmer of decency. Maybe, but the fear of crossing the line, of stepping away from protocol, kept him frozen. Jensen's frustration boiled over. "Everyone back up," she shouted, her voice cracking under the strain. "This is still an active investigation." But the crowd didn't budge. If anything, they leaned in closer, their presence growing stronger, louder. A younger man in the group, Derek, the one holding his phone high, spoke up again. "You know what this is. We all do. And the world's about to see it too." Jensen's eyes darted to the cameras, to the live streams broadcasting this scene beyond the borders of Brookdale Heights. The longer this dragged on, the fewer places there were to hide. Malcolm's voice rose again, smooth but commanding. "You can keep barking orders, Officer Jensen. You can hold on to whatever power you think you have left. But the truth is standing right here, and it's not going anywhere," the crowd murmured in agreement. A low rumble of solidarity. Evelyn's nod was slow, but resolute. And just then, the faint sound of another car approaching broke through the noise, a familiar hum, one that made Jensen's eyes widen slightly. It was the sound of Captain Henry Wallace's cruiser. The headlights cut through the crowd, the vehicle rolling to a stop with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to announce himself. Wallace stepped out, adjusting his belt, surveying the scene with a sharp, practiced gaze. He knew something was off the second he laid eyes on Malcolm standing there, hands clenched at his sides, the duffel bag perched atop the Lexus. His eyes swept across the crowd, reading the tension, the judgment hanging heavy in the air. And then his gaze landed on Jensen. "Carla," he said, his voice low but firm. "What the hell is going on?" Jensen straightened, her defensive posture snapping into place. "Captain, the vehicle matched a stolen car report. During the search, we found this." She gestured again toward the bag, but her voice wavered. Wallace's eyes narrowed. He turned back toward Malcolm, recognition flashing across his face. "Judge Hayes," he said, his tone shifting immediately. I wasn't aware." Malcolm's response was measured, biting. "You weren't told." Wallace's face darkened. He turned back to Jensen, the weight of his glare heavy. "Did you verify the registration before escalating?" Jensen's lips pressed into a thin line, but the silence was her answer. Wallace didn't hesitate. "Remove the cuffs." There were no cuffs. Not yet, but the order itself felt like a crack in the armor. A sign that the tide was turning. Rowan stepped forward, the conflict etched deep into his face. "Captain, the plates came back clean. Registered under Judge Hayes. No stolen reports." The crowd let out a collective breath. Some clapped. Others nodded, vindicated. Wallace's jaw clenched. "We'll discuss this further at the station." Jensen stood stiff, but the defiance in her eyes was dimming. Malcolm remained where he was, his gaze fixed on Wallace. "We're not done here," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This isn't about one bad stop. It's about what you're going to do next." And as the captain turned toward him, the weight of accountability settled in. Ready or not, even with Captain Henry Wallace on the scene, the air didn't clear. If anything, the tension wrapped tighter, like a rope drawn between two immovable forces. The flashing red and blue lights from the squad cars painted everyone in a harsh glow, the officers, the gathered neighbors, and most of all, Judge Malcolm Hayes, who stood like a pillar in the middle of it all. Wallace had ordered things to calm down, but no one could ignore what had already happened. The bag still sat on the hood of Malcolm's Lexus, and though the registration had come back clean, that black duffel remained a question no one wanted to answer. Or maybe a question some already knew the answer to, but refused to speak aloud. Malcolm wasn't budging. His hands, though not cuffed, stayed by his sides, his posture solid. He wasn't about to leave the scene quietly, not after everything that had unfolded. His eyes locked onto Wallace's, waiting, demanding something more than apologies or half measures. "I want answers," Malcolm said, his voice low but filled with fire. "This doesn't end with the plates coming back clean. You're going to explain to me and to everyone here how that bag ended up in my trunk." Wallace shifted, clearing his throat, trying to maintain control. "Judge Hayes, the first understand you're upset. But, upset?" Malcolm cut him off, his voice rising, but still sharp and controlled. "You think this is about feelings? You're standing here because your officers profiled me, searched my car without cause, and found that." He gestured toward the bag, his eyes burning. "You want me to be upset?" "No, Captain. I'm furious, and I'm going to make sure this goes exactly where it needs to," the crowd murmured again, backing Malcolm's words with the kind of quiet outrage that couldn't be contained. Evelyn Robinson stood closer now, arms crossed, nodding, her presence steady as a rock behind Malcolm. Derek, the young man with the camera, kept streaming, his lens capturing every word, every glance, every bead of sweat on Jensen's forehead. But Jensen didn't speak. Her jaw was set, her arms folded tightly across her chest like a shield. Rowan, standing just a few steps behind her, looked like a man trying to disappear into the pavement. Wallace let out a breath, the weight of it sagging his shoulders. He turned back to Jensen, his tone sharp, slicing through the tension. "You didn't check his identity before escalating." Jensen snapped her head up, defensive. "The car matched the description of a stolen vehicle. We had reason to suspect. That reason disappeared the moment you had the plates run," Wallace fired back. "And yet, here we are." Rowan, his voice softer but urgent, stepped forward. "Captain, I didn't know there would be a search. I suggested we verify first." Jensen spun toward him, her eyes blazing. "We found the bag, didn't we? That's what matters." Wallace's glare deepened. "The bag. Let's talk about the bag." His gaze drifted toward Malcolm, then back to his officers. "Anyone here want to explain how that got into Judge Hayes' trunk?" Silence. Not a word, and the silence was damning. Malcolm took a slow step forward, never breaking eye contact with Wallace. "You think I don't know how this works?" he said, voice low, steady, unflinching. "You think this is the first time I've seen someone framed because an officer thought they could get away with it? But tonight, Captain Wallace, you picked the wrong man, and they picked the wrong neighborhood." The crowd rumbled louder now, nodding, murmuring, standing stronger behind Malcolm. There was no turning back. The line had been crossed. Wallace ran a hand over his face, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. He looked around at the neighbors, the cameras, the eyes that would carry this story beyond the borders of Brookdale Heights. "This is out of control," he muttered under his breath. "No," Malcolm corrected, his voice slicing through the tension. "This is control. For once, the story isn't going to be written by the officers who think they can bury the truth." Wallace swallowed hard, the truth of those words hitting him deeper than he cared to admit. His badge had always been a symbol of authority, but tonight it felt like a chain dragging him down. "Captain," Malcolm continued, his voice calmer now but no less commanding, "you're going to do the right thing. You're going to open an investigation, right here, right now, and it's not going to be some quiet internal review that disappears in a stack of paperwork. You're going to be transparent." "Because we're not going anywhere," the crowd cheered, a small burst of energy rolling through them. Wallace looked back at Jensen, saw the rigidity in her posture, the stubbornness that still clung to her face, but she was losing ground. The evidence wasn't on her side anymore. The people weren't on her side. And as much as Wallace wanted to protect his officers, even he could see there was no saving her from this. "I'll call it in," Wallace finally said, pulling out his radio. "We'll get internal affairs involved." Malcolm nodded slowly, but the steel in his eyes didn't waver. "Not enough," he said. "I want every one of these people to hear you say it. You're going to investigate, and you're going to hold your officers accountable." Wallace paused, then turned toward the crowd. His voice, though weary, was firm. "There will be an investigation. I'll ensure it's thorough, and I'll report back to this community." The crowd nodded. But they weren't satisfied, and Malcolm made sure Wallace felt that. "Words are easy, Captain," Malcolm said, his tone quiet but sharp. "I've heard plenty of them. Seen plenty of men like you make promises when the cameras are rolling, then disappear when the heat dies down." Wallace stiffened but said nothing. Jensen finally spoke. Her voice trembled, the edge of her defiance cracking. "I did my job." Malcolm turned toward her, his eyes hard. "No, Officer Jensen. You did something, but it wasn't your job. And now you're going to learn what happens when you cross the line." The crowd was silent again, watching, waiting, because this wasn't over, not even close. Sometimes power doesn't show itself in fists or fury. Sometimes it's in the quiet resolve of a man who refuses to be broken. Judge Malcolm Hayes stood his ground, his feet planted firmly on the pavement of Brookdale Heights, even as the weight of humiliation tried to crush him. His car, his neighborhood, his community, all tainted by this confrontation. But Malcolm wasn't going to let it end here. The glow from the squad car lights continued to swirl, casting sharp shadows across the faces of the crowd. The air was thick, heavy with the mix of anger, tension, and disbelief. And now, with Captain Henry Wallace on the scene, the stakes were higher. The cameras didn't stop rolling. Phones still hovered in the air, capturing every glance, every word. Wallace had promised an investigation. He'd said all the right things. But Malcolm knew better than to trust words alone. Too many times, promises like that were made only to fade when the spotlight dimmed. Tonight, he wasn't going to let that happen. Malcolm's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Captain Wallace, you've made a promise here. But I need you to understand, this doesn't just go away when you drive off. This isn't just between me and Officer Jensen. This is between your department and this entire community." Wallace's jaw tightened. His eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, neighbors, friends, families, people he recognized from barbecues, town hall meetings, maybe even fundraisers. And now, those same people were staring at him like he was the enemy. "I said I'd open an investigation," Wallace repeated. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. "I stand by that." Malcolm stepped closer, his presence calm but towering. Not behind closed doors, not with some quiet report that gets buried in paperwork. "You're going to do this publicly. You're going to show this community that justice isn't just something you wear on your badge." The crowd hummed with approval. Evelyn Robinson nodded, her arms folded across her chest like a general standing behind her soldier. Wallace shifted uncomfortably. "Judge Hayes, with all due respect—" "No," Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "With all due respect, Captain, that's exactly the problem. You think this is something to sweep under the rug, but it's not. This is where it starts." Right here, the duffel bag still sat on the hood of Malcolm's car, its contents laid bare for the world to see, a symbol of everything wrong with how this night had unfolded, a silent accusation that refused to be ignored. "Tell me something, Captain," Malcolm continued, his gaze unwavering. "If this bag hadn't been found, if my plates had come back as stolen, what would have happened to me tonight? Would I be in handcuffs? Would I be sitting in the back of that cruiser? Would anyone be listening to me at all?" Wallace said nothing. He didn't have to. The truth hung heavy in the air. "That's the system we're dealing with," Malcolm said, turning toward the crowd now, his voice rising with passion. "A system that looks at me, sees my skin, and makes assumptions. A system that thinks this bag, this lie, is enough to tear down everything I've worked for." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice joining Malcolm's like a rallying cry. "And it's not just him, it's all of us. How many more times do we have to stand here and prove we belong? The crowd stirred again. Heads nodded. Words of agreement rippled through the gathering. Wallace rubbed the back of his neck, the pressure mounting. He turned toward Officer Mike Rowan, his voice sharp. "Secure the scene. I'll handle this." But Rowan didn't move right away. His eyes flickered toward Malcolm, toward the crowd, then back to Wallace. "Captain," he said quietly, "we've already lost control." Wallace stiffened, the truth of that statement settling deep. His authority, the badge, the uniform, it didn't carry the same weight here tonight, not against the collective voice of the people, standing before him. Malcolm stepped closer again, his voice dropping low but resonating like a gavel in a courtroom. "You can either stand with justice tonight, Captain, or you can stand against it. But know this, we won't be silent. We won't forget." More neighbors emerged from their homes, their faces filled with determination. The small crowd had grown, nearly filling the street. Their voices weren't shouting, but their presence was louder than any protest. This wasn't going away. Wallace took a deep breath, feeling the walls close in. "I'll call internal affairs. I'll bring them here tonight." The words settled over the crowd like a first drop of rain after a drought. Malcolm held Wallace's gaze. "And you'll do it in front of everyone." Wallace nodded reluctantly, reaching for his radio. His voice, though low, carried across the quiet street. "Dispatch. This is Captain Wallace. I need IA on scene at Brookdale Heights." Immediate response. There it was. A small victory. But Malcolm knew it wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. He turned back toward the crowd, his voice rising again. "This is just the beginning. If we want change, we have to hold them accountable every step of the way, because no one else will." The crowd erupted, clapping, nodding, voices of agreement lifting into the night air. Jensen stood off to the side, her arms still crossed, but her face had changed. The smugness was gone, replaced with a crack of fear, uncertainty. The weight of what was coming settled in her eyes. Malcolm looked at her once more, his voice softer now, but still firm. "I hope you're ready to face what you've done." And as the night wore on, the lights continued to flash, the cameras kept rolling, and the story of what happened on that quiet street refused to fade. The fight for justice had only just begun. There's a difference between hearing words and feeling them. Captain Henry Wallace had said all the right things he'd called in internal affairs, promised an investigation, but the tension on that quiet street didn't ease. No one relaxed, because words, no matter how well spoken, weren't enough to undo the damage done. Judge Malcolm Hayes stood there, his feet planted in defiance, as the neighborhood buzzed around him. The crowd had grown in size and volume, their unity a powerful force, louder than any siren or squad car. Cell phones still hovered, streaming every second, beaming the truth out into the world, the truth that wasn't going away. The duffel bag, that planted lie, sat untouched on the hood of Malcolm's Lexus. It was a symbol now not just of what had been done to him, but of what had been done to countless others who never got the chance to fight back. Malcolm's voice cut through the thick air, steady as ever. "Captain Wallace," he said, locking eyes with the man who was supposed to uphold justice, "we're not going to let this disappear. I want you to understand something. This isn't just about me. This is about every black man, every black woman who's been stopped, searched, humiliated because of a story you've written in your head before they ever open their mouth." The crowd murmured, a wave of agreement rolling through them. Wallace shifted on his feet, feeling the judgment in the eyes around him. He wasn't just a captain tonight. He was the face of a system that had failed too many times, and now that failure was on display. "I'm not walking away with promises," Malcolm continued, his voice rising with quiet power. "You're going to face this. You're going to face me. You're going to face this community." The power of those words settled over everyone. Evelyn Robinson stood firm at Malcolm's side, her arms crossed, her silver hair glinting under the streetlights. Her eyes never left Wallace. "You can call in internal affairs all you want," Evelyn said, her voice sharp as a blade. "But if you think we're going to trust that, you don't know us at all." Wallace's jaw clenched, his gaze darting between the neighbors, the cameras, and the officers who stood uneasily behind him. Officer Mike Rowan looked like he wanted to disappear, his head lowered, shoulders hunched, but Officer Carla Jensen, she stood rigid, her arms folded across her chest, her face a mask of stubborn defiance. Yet her eyes told a different story now. The cracks were showing. Malcolm turned toward Jensen, his voice quieter but no less fierce. "Do you have anything to say, Officer Jensen?" "Anything at all." She stayed silent. But the silence was deafening. Wallace tried to step in, his voice wavering. "Judge Hayes, I'll make sure the investigation is fair." Malcolm snapped his head toward him. "Fair?" he echoed, disbelief thick in his tone. "You think fairness is enough? You think I'm looking for fair after being treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood? I'm looking for accountability. I'm looking for change." The crowd responded again, nodding, murmuring, standing taller behind Malcolm's words. "You want to prove something?" Malcolm said, taking a slow step toward Wallace. "Then say it. Right here. Right now. Tell this community that what happened tonight was wrong." Wallace hesitated, his lips pressed together, and for a moment it seemed like he might walk away. But the weight of the cameras, the crowd, the truth pressing down on him forced his next move. He cleared his throat, his voice rough around the edges. What happened tonight should not have happened. The stop, the search, the way it was handled, it was wrong. It wasn't loud. It wasn't impassioned. But the words rang out, hanging heavy in the night air. Malcolm didn't nod. He didn't thank him. He just held Wallace's gaze, making sure the man felt every ounce of what he'd just said. "That's a start," Malcolm said. "But like I told you before, words aren't enough." Wallace looked away, the weight of shame pressing down hard now. He turned back to Rowan and Jensen. "We're securing the scene until IA arrives. No one leaves." The crowd didn't move. They stayed right where they were, watching, recording, holding the line. And then Malcolm turned toward his neighbors, his voice softer, but still steady. "This isn't over tonight. Not by a long shot. But we've made them see us, made them hear us." Evelyn stepped up beside him, nodding. "And we'll keep standing. We'll keep showing up until they can't ignore us anymore." The streetlights flickered overhead. The squad cars kept flashing. But something had shifted. The balance of power was no longer tipped against Malcolm and his community. They stood strong, unified, determined to see this fight through. Jensen, for the first time, lowered her arms. Her gaze faltered. The defiance that had carried her this far couldn't shield her from the truth any longer. Malcolm faced her one last time that night. "I hope you learned something from this, Officer Jensen," he said, "because we'll be here, watching, making sure you don't forget." As the night dragged on, the tension never fully broke. But the cracks in the system had been exposed for all to see, and Judge Malcolm Hayes, standing firm in the face of humiliation, had made sure this wasn't just another story buried in silence. This was the beginning of something more. Sometimes, the hardest battles don't end when the flashing lights fade. They don't end when the crowd disperses or when the promises are made. No, the hardest battles stretch on quiet and steady long after the moment has passed. Judge Malcolm Hayes knew that better than anyone. As the night in Brookdale Heights slowly gave way to dawn, as neighbors returned to their homes and the squad cars pulled away one by one, the weight of what had happened remained. But this wasn't going to be one of those stories that faded with the morning sun. Not this time. The next day, the videos of the incident had already spread far beyond the quiet streets of the neighborhood. What had begun as a traffic stop turned public humiliation was now a national headline. Footage of Malcolm standing tall, surrounded by flashing lights and a sea of cell phones, was everywhere. On social media, in news feeds, on television screens, people weren't just watching, they were demanding answers. Justice for Malcolm was trending within hours. And not just in Brookdale Heights, across the state, across the country. But Malcolm wasn't sitting back, watching the world react. He knew the power of momentum, and he knew that moments like these had to be used to push, to demand, to create something lasting. So he acted. That evening, under the fading glow of the same streetlights that had illuminated his humiliation, Malcolm gathered his community again. This time, it wasn't on the sidewalk. It was at the Brookdale Heights Community Center, a place where people came together not just to meet, but to make change. The room filled fast. Standing room only. Faces old and young. Neighbors, friends, activists, reporters, city officials, even some off-duty officers who had heard what had happened and couldn't stay away. Everyone wanted to hear what came next. Malcolm stood at the front of the room, the duffel bag, the very one used to frame him, sitting beside him on a table. Its presence was deliberate, a reminder. When he spoke, his voice wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter, but it was filled with the kind of quiet power that made people lean in. "I'm not here tonight to talk about what happened to me," Malcolm began, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "You've seen the videos. You know the story. But this isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows things like this to happen again and again." The room nodded. Murmurs of agreement echoed off the walls. "I've stood in courtrooms my entire life, fighting for justice. But last night, I stood on the other side of that line, and I felt what too many others have felt for far too long." Malcolm paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. "We can't change what happened, but we can decide what happens next." He outlined his plan, not just an investigation into Officer Jensen and the Brookdale Heights Police Department, but a call for real reforms. Community oversight, bias training that went deeper than a weekend seminar, regular forums where police and residents could sit face-to-face and confront the truths they'd been avoiding for years. But more than that, Malcolm called for accountability. "I want Officer Jensen held responsible for what she did," he said, his voice steady, eyes hard, "because if there's no consequence, there's no lesson. And if there's no lesson, this happens again." The crowd erupted in applause, but then something unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a figure stood, Officer Jensen, her uniform gone, replaced by civilian clothes. Her posture wasn't defensive. Now, it was hesitant. Her face wasn't hard. It was worn. She stepped forward, all eyes locking onto her as the room fell silent. "I wasn't sure I should come here tonight," Jensen began, her voice rough around the edges. "But after last night, I realized something." She paused, swallowing hard. "I realized I've been part of the problem." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "I thought I was just doing my job," Jensen continued, her voice softer now. "But I let my fear, my bias, tell me a story about a man I didn't even know, and I almost destroyed his life." She turned to face Malcolm fully. "I can't undo what I did to you, but I can start by admitting I was wrong, and I can promise to be better." The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Malcolm stood still, weighing every word. And then, slowly, he nodded. "It's a start," he said, his voice even. "But it's going to take more than words." Jensen nodded. "I know," she announced, that she'd voluntarily step away from active duty while undergoing intensive bias and de-escalation training. And not just for herself, she committed to working with Malcolm and the community to develop better programs for the entire department. The crowd murmured, unsure at first. But as Jensen's voice steadied, something shifted. Maybe it was the first crack in the wall. As the meeting ended, Malcolm stepped outside, the cool evening air filling his lungs. The duffel bag still sat on the table inside, but its power was gone. It was just a bag now, an empty symbol of something that wouldn't be buried, because Malcolm knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, it felt like they weren't fighting alone. Change wasn't coming. It was already here, and Malcolm Hayes, standing under those streetlights once more, knew that what started with a single traffic stop would ripple far beyond the borders of Brookdale Heights. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was their story. In life, there are moments that remind us just how fragile dignity can be, how quickly respect can be stripped away by prejudice and fear, but there's also power in standing your ground, in refusing to be silent in the face of injustice. Judge Malcolm Hayes' story teaches us that no matter how high you climb, no matter how much good you do, bias can still find you. Yet, it's in those moments, when your back is against the wall, that your voice matters most. This isn't just a story about a wrongful traffic stop. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in holding the system accountable. Whether we're standing on the street, watching from our porches, or speaking up in a crowded room, our voices, especially when joined together, can force change. For those of us who've seen a lifetime of struggles and victories, this story calls us to remember it's never too late to stand for justice, to speak for those who can't, and to ensure that respect isn't just earned, it's demanded. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who believe in standing up for what's right. Together, we can make a difference.